to the defense of Israel. This past summer, before I go on, the reason that they trained me to do that is, do you guys know? Why did I just learn how to make a left turn and a right turn? Why did they pay for 6 months of training and service for me, just to make 2 turns?
Reserve.
What? Reserve. To do miluim, which is reserve duty. So up until I'm 40 or 45, I can do reserve duty. And one thing that gets stressed to me in basic training, when it was, like I said, in basic training I was with all other people who were also slated to become truck drivers. Everyone talks about how we're stupid soldiers and we're bad soldiers and we're dumb soldiers. And the mifakdot, the commanders, whose main job it is to yell at you, but every 1% of their day they devote to trying to make you feel good and important. 99% is to beat you down, but that 1% you get picked up and feel good. They would tell us, actually, truck drivers is really important. Anytime a war happens, the first people on reserve duty that get called up are the truck drivers. Not the combat soldiers, not the fighter pilots, not any of that, the truck drivers. Because no army can ever do anything without a bunch of truck drivers. Which made me feel somewhat important, but not that great, because I was getting yelled at 99% of the time. This past summer, I was the director of a summer program in Israel called MBI. It's with Habunim, the youth movement I grew up in. And this is what I was doing most of the time. We had to completely redo the schedule because the war happened, and it completely changed my summer, and it was quite stressful, but overall it was a really positive experience. This is me at a ceremony on the summer program. Does anyone know where this is? It's not the highest quality photo, but it's at stable care. Specific, yeah. This is at Kever Ben Gurion's grave, and overlooking a beautiful canyon in the middle of the Negev. And this is what I was doing with most of my summer. And I was having a pretty good time. A little bit war got me down, but not too much. And then in the beginning of the summer, they called me and were like, "You have to come in the first day of the operation." What my mifakdot told me in basic training was true. The first day of the operation, they called me and said, "You have to come in." And I got a letter from the Jewish agency saying George is responsible for 120 kids and a staff and psychological issues and medical issues and flights and all that, and George can't come in. And the army said, "Okay, you're released." But then the last week of the program, which was 4.5 weeks into the war, they called me again and said, "You have to come in for real this time." So I came in, and in addition to sitting around a bunch, which is one of the main activities one does in the army, they trained me to drive this truck, which was from 1972, which means it's been around since the Yom Kippur War, which was many wars ago. Someone took off the little Mercedes symbol, but other than that, it would have looked really cool. Instead of an exhaust pipe, it has this kind of chimney thing, and it's a pretty hideous truck. It's incredibly hard to drive. The steering wheel is, not joking, this big, and it's a double clutch stick shift that is the loudest, least enjoyable thing I've ever driven. It doesn't have seat belts, it doesn't have radio, it doesn't have air conditioning. In fact, it permanently releases heat by your feet. So in the Israeli summer, you have permanent heat supply from the engine coming out by your feet. This is the dashboard. If you can see it, I think it has leprosy, which I didn't know motorized vehicles could have. And you can see, that's a steering wheel. You can see, like, the steering wheel is that much bigger than the dashboard, that you can see through that entire really big thing through the steering wheel, because the steering wheel was this big. It doesn't have radio, it doesn't have seat belts. It was a pleasure to drive. It was very interesting. It fell apart the whole time. This is my engine. It melted down twice. It overheated twice, and I would always call the people in charge and say, what do I do? My engine's overheating, it's making smoke, and the thing says it's higher than it's allowed to measure. And they, just keep driving and let us know if you have any problems. that was the textbook answer. I was like, I think I'm happy. They're like, no, happens all the time. Also, did you add water? I was like, and the one time they were like, you need to add water. So I had this jug that you're supposed to use to fill up the engine so it has water to cool itself down. So I did one of those, and then it wasn't full. So then I did another one. I was like, okay, I don't want to overdo it, so I'll just do 2 of these things. Then the next day it overheated again, and they're like, add another one of those, and then I added another one of those. In the end, I added over 30 liters of water, which is a ridiculous amount of water to add to an engine at one time. And the truck was falling apart the whole time, so that was one thing. When I first got there, it was a ceasefire. The first 3-day ceasefire, you guys remember there was like 72-hour ceasefire, then no ceasefire, then 72-hour ceasefire, then no ceasefire, then 5-day ceasefire, then war, then permanent ceasefire, something like that. I first got there in a ceasefire, so I did a 25-minute lesson on this truck, at which point I was not prepared to drive it by any means. But the guy teaching me said, don't worry, it's ceasefire, war's over, you're never going to need to drive it. The next day, I came back in, and I sat around and did nothing for a little while, which is the best part of the army. And then someone called me up and told me you have to go to Zikim. I was like, oh, that's cool. What's that? And he's like, oh yeah, you'll figure it out. Someone will explain to you how to get on the map. But you need to go get a kickback, which is like your bag with a bunch of shit, and you have to get a gun, which was a gun, it was a Galil, which the Israeli army doesn't use except for reservist truck drivers during wartime. So no one in the entire army is trained on this gun, but they issued me this gun and sent me to Zikim. And this is Zikim. That's the Gaza border. That's Kibbutz Zikim, and that's the base. This is all from Google Maps. This is not like classified IDF images. So this is also what Hamas can see, if not more. And when I got sent down to Zikim, I was like, why have I heard Zikim? Do I have a family friend there? Was Zikim in the news? Why do I know the name Zikim? Do you guys know why I know the name Zikim? Does anyone know?
Terrorists try to infiltrate through the sea to the kibbutz Zikim.
Yeah.
And also it's a huge military base.
Yeah, it's a huge military base, but I've never been there during my non-reserve duty. I don't even know what to call that, but Hamas trained like Navy SEALs, kind of Navy commandos. They go out in a boat, go underwater, have scuba gear, and then pop up in the water with big guns. And they, for the first time ever, and Israel didn't know they did that until after the first attack happened. And they sent them to Zikim to visit me and my friend. But luckily it was before I got there. It was 2 or 3 weeks before I got there. And they landed right there on this beach, and they were coming up the beach, and they got killed. So I got there, and the first thing I did was I looked up Zikim on my phone. Then I found out this is where that happened. And then they showed me where I was sleeping. And I was sleeping where the red little circle is, which is the gate closest to the water. And people told me they were killed 100 meters from the gate, which was probably an exaggeration, probably 200 or 300 meters. And then I looked at the people doing guard duty on this base, and they didn't. I'm not a real soldier. I'm like a truck driver that tries to avoid any gun that he can. And I looked at these soldiers, and they're like more real than me, but not real enough that you want that the Hamas Navy SEALs I will be saved from them by these guys. So I was kind of worried, and the base was 90% evacuated, so I was really worried, and I was sleeping at literally the room closest to the ocean, closest to the gate facing the ocean. So I was pretty worried about that. But then I later did more research, and I found out what actually happened, which is the Hamas Navy SEALs guys landed on the water, and then someone doing surveillance saw them in a camera, and instead of people from my base protecting me, which would not have been good, they sent in the Navy on a boat, and the Navy shot them from the sea. And this is an infantry base, and these guys came in and shot them from the land, and the Air Force came in and bombed them. So they were all killed several times over before the kind of mediocre soldiers guarding my base had a chance to do anything, which was reassuring. So that's what happened there. That's why Zikim was famous. When I got there, as I mentioned, it was 90% evacuated. My base, this base that I was on, was a training base. It's where the Home Front Command, who's in charge of search and rescue and releasing guidelines about how close you need to be to a bomb shelter depending on where you live. They're in charge of everything connected to the Israeli home front. That's where they do their training. But because it's a training base, it's not defending the country in any way. They evacuated all the soldiers, but the minimum number of soldiers to do guard duty. So it's this massive base that holds over 1,000 people, but there's only about 100 soldiers there. So we didn't eat in the Chadarochel, the kitchen wasn't working. They brought in food for us, but it had this very empty feeling. And when I got there, it was still ceasefire, and life was all right, and I was much more worried about my truck than anything else. Then the ceasefire expired, and that means they put in the emergency protocols, which means you have to walk around with clips in your gun, like clips of 30 bullets, which I'd never done before in my life and wasn't really trained to do, especially with a gun I'd never held before in my life. But you have to wear a shachpatz, which is a flak jacket, which is something I'd heard about from video games, but had no idea what it was. But apparently, it protects you from mortar attacks, not in case the mortar hits you, because then you blow up and die anyway, but from the shrapnel from the mortar attacks, and you have to carry around a helmet. So the base was only 1 mile from the border, so it's from the border, so it's in mortar range, and mortars are much more dangerous than rockets, but they can only go a mile and a half. So you have to wear all these things and follow all these rules that were very bizarre to me as someone that remembered my training consisted of going left, then going right. This was seemed a lot more real than anything else that I'd ever done in terms of militariness. And all the other soldiers there, because they'd been there the whole time, and this was what was the most bizarre for me, they'd given up on wearing the flak jackets. They no longer carried their helmets around. They were just like, yeah, we die, it's no big deal. And whenever explosions would happen, I would run for cover, and they'd be like, oh, no, that's our explosions. Their explosions are like, and our explosions are like, and I was like, that's the same explosion sound. And they're like, no, and they would laugh at me like, oh, I'm running for cover. I was like, I'm not joking around. I just want to, if I hear booms, I'm just hiding. That's my thing. And they were like, no, it's no big deal. So, one, they'd grown bizarrely used to it. Which I think happens in any life or death scenario. At first you're like, holy shit, but at a certain point you're like, whatever, I don't care. Or I care less than I initially did. And when you hear a rocket taking off from Gaza, but there's no warning sounds, there's no like siren, that means it's going to go over our heads and hit Ashdod or Tel Aviv or something like that. So people, instead of hiding, which is what I did, would actually pull up, try and watch, because then you can see interceptions of the Iron Dome hitting it, and then it looks kind of like crazy fireworks. But I didn't watch it as a spectator sport. Like I said, I was hiding the whole time. And this was a stressful time for me, and when that first happened, there was still, I think the kids on the summer program that I left a few days early were still there, and I was still having to call some of their parents and deal with some of that. I was still driving my truck every day, and it was a pretty hectic time, and my parents were quite worried. And it was not an easy time for me. The one good thing I will say is this, I think, is probably the coolest picture of me that will ever be taken. That's one positive to come out of it. Also, I don't know if you guys pick on this, but anyone that's been a soldier immediately will pick up on this, that I'm wearing sneakers instead of army boots. My shirt's not tucked in, I don't have a shaved head. I'm in reserve duty. Instead of getting yelled at, people that are in charge treat you with respect, and it's this whole new feeling of being in the army, and all of a sudden people are like, thanks so much for coming, we really appreciate this, come sit in my office, make yourself a coffee, have some air conditioning, and they treat you like a human being and someone with a good spirit, which is really nice. Then there was more war, then there was more ceasefire, and the last day of truck driving, they called us up in the morning and they said every single reservist truck driver is being released today. So get back to the base, my base outside of Haifa, my original base, as quickly as possible. So I asked permission from my commander at my new base near Gaza to do as little work as possible. It's like, yeah, I'll do something. But what he really did was he gave me the longest day of work I've ever done in a truck. He made me drive to north of Netanya, then drive back down to the Gaza border, then I had to drive to Haifa, and it took a really long time. And I had the great pleasure of driving along, switching from one highway to another. And this is what the bumper of a truck normally looks like. Trucks have metal bumpers rather than plastic or rubber bumpers like a car. And I was driving along the highway, and I heard the loudest sound I've ever heard from this truck, which had made a lot of loud sounds. And everyone next to me was like pulling over. And I knew something was seriously wrong, but for several miles there was no shoulder. So I finally found half a shoulder, and the right side is actually like dirt and grass, not actually paved anything. And I looked over and I discovered that this was the condition of my truck. And I don't know if you guys noticed, but in the first picture is actually the second picture. Being the proper, well-trained soldier that I am, I tied it up with a bunch of rope and string. And that was how I drove my truck for the longest day of truck driving that I've ever done. And I called my base, and I called my commander, and he's like, oh, this isn't good. Yeah, but if we call like the fix-it guys, that's going to take like 6 hours. Then you're screwed and you won't get released today. And I hadn't been home for a few weeks. And I'd come from a summer program where before that I hadn't been home for 7 weeks. I had one night at home between running a 7-week summer program and going to the Gaza border. So I was like, shit, I really want to go home. So I was like, and I called him back, he's like, no, I fixed it, it's totally fine. And he's like, no, we have to call the truck driving repair shop, we have to call the operations department on the base, everyone has to give approval. I was like, look, it's so good though. And I said I didn't take pictures because I thought like, oh, I should record this for posterity. I took pictures because, like the picture of the engine that I showed you before, I was sending sending my commander like the engine's way too hot and it's burning everything and whatever. So that's how most of these pictures got taken, besides the one that I looked really cool in. But then the operations department finally called me and they're like, are you sure this is going to hold, George? And I was like, yeah, 100%. And they're like, are you so sure? Are you like 110% sure? And I was like, yeah. And they're like, okay, do that same thing 2 or 3 more times and then you can go. So then I tied it up with another rope and then I drove. And it actually held much better than the original truck. I drove to north of Netanya to a little beachy field thing, picked up a bunch of people that loaded it. I drove back there, and then I'm sitting at this base near my base near the Gaza border, waiting for them to unload, and then I can drive back, return my truck, and then I'm a free man, and I'm really excited. And unlike when you're a regular soldier, when you need to charge your phone, there's like these poles on army bases that have like 30 outlets that you sit around and with 30 other soldiers like uncomfortably standing there, and that's the way to charge your phone. When you're a reserve soldier and you're an important, respected individual, you go to the highest ranking officer you can find and say, can I please sit in your air-conditioned office and charge my phone in peace and quiet? And they're like, oh, of course, I totally understand that you need air conditioning to charge your cell phone. So the last thing I did before, like I said, I drove up, returned my truck, and became a free individual again. I went to sit in this office, and this office, I looked up, had a giant hole in the roof, and that's what happened, and 2 weeks prior, something like that, a mortar shell landed in this office. That normally would mean that this office wouldn't exist anymore and that all the officers around would have been killed. Luckily, it punctured the roof, hit the ground, and then never exploded. And they called in the bomb squad, they anesthetized it. I don't know what the word is for mortar shells because I don't know that kind of stuff. And no one died. But this is the last office I sat in when I was in the Army. Was this, and that kind of summed up my experiences. In the end, I was safe, I was fine, but it was this bizarre reality of danger amidst the normal sanity that is my life. So that was the end. I returned my truck, and I was a free man by that night, and I actually got a little present from the Army. Said thank you for fighting in Sulketan, which is the name of the operation. What was it called in English? Protective Edge. Got a little cell phone charger on the go, which is exactly what I wanted because the whole day when I was driving that truck that was from 1972, I was like, there's no way to charge my cell phone. So someone somewhere is smart. Anyways, so that was my experience. Like I said, this has all been my own personal experience, not that many thoughts about the war, about its justness, about its effects, the future of what's coming out of this operation. So I want to close with some of those, which you guys can feel free to agree or disagree with, and then it's going to be open to questions about whatever your thoughts are or questions are. So my first closing thought is about justness. Anytime you fight in a war, unless you love beating your chest and think that your country is always right, you need to ask yourself, is this a justified war? Are these specific actions within the war justified, and is the war as a whole justified? This for me was a confusing question. The last Israel-Gaza war that happened was while I was in basic training, And it started with Israel, the commander of Hamas's military wing was driving down the street in Gaza. Israel blew him up, and then a war broke out. And I was opposed to that specific action because it led to it was only a week, but it was a lot of violence and people killed. And not that I particularly care about Hamas military commanders' right to live or die, but that it would have been better had Israel not done that war. This war, on the other hand, it had a lot of complicated things to do with the kidnappings and then a lot of arrests after the kidnappings. Then Hamas started shooting rockets, and Israel said stop shooting rockets. Then Hamas kept shooting rockets. It was more complicated, and it's not black or white. But for me, it was a much more justified war. I'm not sure if it was a completely good idea on Israel's part. But Hamas was shooting rockets, and Hamas did have a chance to end the war after a week or two when Egypt proposed a ceasefire that was more or less the same as the ceasefire that was proposed in the end. Slightly less favorable to Hamas, but Hamas rejected it and chose to have over a month of war and have another 2,000 Gazans die and have another 70 Israelis die when they could have avoided it. And that was a shame. So I don't know. I don't feel like it was a completely justified war, but I don't think it was completely unethical, the fact that it happened. And I think, my personal opinion is that when Hamas is hiding rocket launchers in civilian areas, whether it's a school or a mosque or something like that, Israel is justified. I don't know if it's worth it in terms of loss of human life, but Israel is justified in attacking that, even if they know that it's going to lead to civilian casualties. What I think is not justified is Israel has a procedure called the Hannibal procedure, where if a soldier is kidnapped, they don't want another Gilad Shalit scenario where someone's hidden in a Hamas underground bunker for 5 years and Israel has to release over 1,000 Palestinian prisoners to get one Israeli prisoner back. Which I understand the Israeli government's logic in that they really, really don't want that to happen. So the policy is if an Israeli soldier is kidnapped and they think he's most likely to be alive, to wreak as much havoc on the area around the soldier as possible, at the risk of not only killing lots of people from the other side, but also very likely killing the Israeli soldier. So a low-ranking officer named Lieutenant Goldin was kidnapped by Hamas. They're still not sure whether he was dead or alive when he was kidnapped. He was kidnapped in southern Gaza in a tunnel. And they took him back to Rafiah, which is a city in the southern Gaza Strip. And Israel, the area where the tunnel ended on the other side, Israel blew the crap out of that area. And I think, I'd have to double check this, but I think killed over 100 people. And potentially the lieutenant himself, although it's quite likely he was already dead, but anyways, he's definitely dead now. And I understand not wanting to have a Gilad Shalit scenario again, but I think killing over 100 people for one soldier who we don't even know whether he's alive, I think that is not an ethical action. And I don't know any international war law, but it's quite possibly not legal under international law. And I think we need to ask those hard questions. But also, like I said, I'm not opposed to all military actions. Sometimes military actions are justified, and sometimes they're not. And I think we need to ask tough questions on both sides of that. The day after the war, Benjamin Netanyahu, our prime minister, gave a speech saying that there's a new diplomatic horizon in the Middle East. Was this in the press here? I don't know. It was in the Israeli press. And this was somewhat true. For Egypt, which is a cold ally, a peaceful neighbor of Israel, and Saudi Arabia, which is not an ally by any means, were remarkably quiet during the whole war. They didn't speak that much about how great and brave the Gazans were at all. And they essentially, because of the spread of radical Islam with the Muslim Brotherhood and with ISIS and Hezbollah and Iran and things like that, they're much more worried about the Shia spread and the spread of radical Sunni Islam connected to ISIS and the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas than they are about Israel. And they essentially did not oppose Israel too much. Last night, 2 nights ago, it just came out in the press yesterday, Tzipi Livni was in New York and she had dinner with a bunch of Arab foreign ministers. The Egyptian and Jordanian foreign ministers, we have peace with them, that's no big deal, but also the Saudi foreign minister and the Kuwaiti foreign minister, and people that normally will never speak to Israel actually were willing to meet with Israel's, not foreign minister, she's justice minister in charge of negotiations with the Palestinians. And something like that normally doesn't ever happen, and the moderate Arab states are more willing to consider a peace plan with Israel than before, and that's a really good thing. Unfortunately, there's been no display that the Israeli government right now is pursuing that peace more seriously and is taking advantage of the diplomatic horizon. And that to me is a real big shame because there are a lot of Arab states, the majority of Arab states, that if Israel was to make peace with the Palestinians and give them a state of their own and give them independence, and we would get security promises out of them, that would be willing to live in peace with Israel. And I think we really ought to take advantage of that opportunity. And I think we're not doing enough to do that, which is a really big shame. The thing that bothered me the most about this war on a personal perspective is not that I had to go to a very dangerous place and really upset a lot of my friends and family and things like that. The thing that most upsets me about it is that I'm probably going to do it again in a few years, unless part of that is, it must be said, is Hamas's responsibility, and they are pretty much an evil organization that uses casualties on their side and on the other side to their own political advantage. But part of that is the Israeli government is not doing much to avert another war, and most Israelis expect there to be another similar war in a year or 2 or 3 or 4. It could be a little bit smaller, a little bit bigger. Nobody knows exactly what it will look like because each round's slightly different. But it's almost become a farce. The fact that every 2 or 3 years there's a war between southern Israel and Gaza that looks the same, just in varying degrees of seriousness and length. And there's no serious feeling on either side of the border that that's going to change, and that is really a shame. And I think that there's essentially 2 ways to get rid of the Hamas government. One is to go in there and reoccupy the Gaza Strip, which will lead to hundreds of Israeli casualties, and in fact many thousands of Palestinian casualties, and mean Israel has to reoccupy very dangerous enemy territory. It will take at least a year of occupation to clean out all the terror cells and tunnels and underground everything, and will be bad for Israel, but will lead to the end of Hamas. And that is the more right-wing solution. And then there's the more left-wing solution, which is to bolster the moderates, make life in the West Bank so good, and peace look actually possible, so that the Palestinians in Gaza are so incredibly irritated at Hamas that Hamas's approval rating plummets. There might be a revolution. If there are ever Palestinian elections, Hamas will definitely be voted out of office. And that's the other option. That's the more left-wing option. Use peace to make Hamas look like idiots. Right now, Benjamin Netanyahu is doing neither of those options. He's not willing to defeat them on the diplomatic plane through a serious peace process, or on the military plane through a war, which will be very violent but could eliminate Hamas. And I think he's essentially just trying to stay alive as a politician. That's what he does best. He's deep into his 3rd term as prime minister. He's never had any major accomplishment, but he's also never brought on a terrible destruction or disaster on the Israeli people, and that's what he does. You don't get anything great, you don't get anything bad. That's what he runs on. Lastly, I guess the point I want to close on is about fighting Hamas. Like I said, in my opinion, Hamas is an evil organization. They are incredibly gifted politicians. They came out on this war. Their approval rating doubled over the course of this war, and they knew that, and that's why they kept fighting the war, even though it seemed stupid and so many of their own people were being killed. They knew that politically it was to their advantage. The question is, when you fight Hamas in a long-term sense, is for Israel, is how do you not become like Hamas? And you can go back and read some of the short stories written by soldiers that were in the first Intifada in the late 80s, early 90s. They were about, that's when Hamas came into existence. They're about, when I fight with Hamasniks and they're doing secretive things and evil things and whatever, how do I not become more like them? And they wrote sometimes that I am becoming actually kind of more like them and understanding their logic and acting more like them. And when Israel fights an enemy that is evil, and that's how I consider them, not the Palestinian people, but Hamas as a political organization and a military organization, how do you not become more like them? And I think it's really easy, and I think the American society or military, whatever, after the September 11th attacks, took away a lot of civil liberties, did a lot of torturous things in secret bases in other countries, and became less of a democratic society. And Israel, when you fight an illiberal enemy that doesn't believe in basic liberal and democratic values, it's very easy to become more like them. And Israel needs to on an ethical sense, defend its own morality, and that's one of the worst things that can happen. Is not just that human life is lost, but that your own sense of democracy and morality and justness can be corrupted. And I really hope that we can minimize that, and I hope that we're not just going to have another round of the exact same fighting in a few years. But right now, I wish I could say the government was doing more to take advantage of that, but right now I don't see that they are. But the opportunity is there, it'll be hard, and we'll have to make compromises and sacrifices, but I wish we were doing that more. The last thing is Israel still is a democracy, and there's a lot of left-wing people saying that there's no free speech in Israel anymore, and that right-wing people beat left-wing people up in the street, and fascism is completely taken over. That's also not true. Israel's a democracy. The press is entirely free. People can say whatever they want. There are right-wing thugs that act like assholes and try and silence everyone who disagrees with them, and that is dangerous. We should take that on. But Israel still is a democracy, and you can say what you want and do what you want. And I don't know. We should take on those violent people, but they haven't completely won and destroyed all freedom. So that's it. That's my story and thoughts and things. Wow, I talked longer than I intended to. What do you guys think? What do you guys want to know about politics, about urban kibbutz, about the military, about my experience? Nobody's thoughts? Questions? I was completely right in my analysis of everything. Nobody? I was talking about how the right wing's stupid and the left wing's stupid. I must have offended at least half of you. Everybody.
What do you think about the seriousness of the tunnels? Because you didn't really talk about much about the tunnels. About justification for war.
That's a really important element. It's reported in the Israeli press, but not in the American, not in the international media, and the government never explicitly confirmed or denied that Hamas had a massive plan to go through all the tunnels at once on Rosh Hashanah when most soldiers are not on their army bases, and go to all the kibbutzim right around the Gaza Strip, and when everyone's eating their fancy nice dinner in the kibbutz Harochel, to attack all of them at once. I don't know whether that's true or not. It's been reported in the Israeli media, and that would have been the biggest civilian catastrophe probably in Israeli history if that did happen. That's a really important consideration, and I would not be surprised if Hamas wanted to do that. I'm not entirely sure if that's true, but that's another reason that I think Hamas is evil and is willing to use any tactic to further their own interests, and that is a part of a justification for a larger military campaign. When Israel started the military campaign, they didn't mention that whatsoever. So that's another important factor. But they didn't say we're going in for the tunnels. After 2 weeks, they didn't have any clear objective, and then they decided we're going to get rid of all the tunnels. Maybe it was just 1 week, but that when they started the war, they said we need to stop the rocket fire. And then later on, they said we also need to blow up all the tunnels. So I don't know if that was the proximate cause or the real justification of the war, but it is something that needs to be taken into account and could have led, like I said, to the largest civilian catastrophe in Israeli history. Yeah?
Yeah, I would say I lean more left, and I didn't find this war to justify in a lot of ways, and I think that, at least for me as a person who does feel very Jewish and who wants to support Israel when this war happened, and there was casualties that I think in a lot of ways people assume that it was human shields, and I'm not saying that's not true, but I'm saying that there is a lot of rhetoric out there that is not necessarily justifiable, and I like the way they use that word. And I'm just wondering what you think about, because for me I'm very interested in how the media portrays the war, and how do you think, what do you think like the mainstream media
In Israel or in
America,
the world?
I would say in the United States and Canada, just in terms of who do you think was spreading